Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you another cause of the revolution in France, which are the short and long-term economic problems that have been affecting the nation. If you haven't already, do make sure you check out my previous videos. We've already gone over some earlier causes of the war and, of course, some institutional problems that have affected the society's structure. Do of course remember as well, these are videos geared towards the A level and student level, and therefore they're going to have some key context throughout that'll prove useful in those studies. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So in this video, we're going to be exploring the economic problem. So we have to understand what exactly was the state of France's economy by the 1780s. How exactly are taxes causing a huge problem for French society? If you watch my previous videos, you'll already be aware that the taxation was already unfavorably burdening the third estate, especially the peasantry. And how exactly was this changed or improved remains to be seen. And of course, we have to look at rural and urban food prices as well, and how poverty is not just affecting those on the land, but also those in the cities as well, and how exactly is it being mishandled. So first off, I just want to give us a bit of background onto economics as a whole. Again, so when you're writing your essays, when you're having your debates, when you're forming your own interpretation of the events, you have this knowledge to use and therefore understand the events as best you can. So in economics, any government is aiming to have something called a balanced budget. Now, what this means is the government wants to have a surplus of money, whereby the money their economy is making is more than the amount they spend. So when you have things like healthcare, defense spending, road tax, employment, all these kind of things, what you want to make sure what the government spend their money on with that is always going to be less than actually over it. Now, of course, that's the general rule, but governments will tend to spend more because they want to, of course, use that money while it's available. That's what it's for, especially a government that is for the people, trying to make lives better for everyone in the nation. While it's good to be in a surplus of a budget, they may face criticism for cutting costs rather than using the money for what it's for, which is to spend. However, the reason some people in government will be against spending masses of money is because they risk falling into a deficit. This is where they spend more money than they intended, and to cover the costs by going over budget, they have to borrow money to afford the way of life they're trying to create. Built on this idea of we need to have a bit of inflation in our lives. So borrowing money to cause inflation is pretty much accepted by the majority of economists today, especially those who are running governments throughout the world, especially in our capitalist led society. Now, inflation can be seen as bad in concept because it weakens your currency. Whether the currency of your nation weakens, the price of gold tends to rise. But the actual value of the gold arguably doesn't change because it's not getting richer, because the currency itself is actually getting poorer. Gold and material assets are an offset against that. However, this kind of inflation is accepted because while in theory it does make a nation and the people in it poorer every year by about 2%, as long as inflation isn't super high, as long as it's not spiraling out of control, it's actually a great way for the economy to make work and make more money in the long term. Most economies are aiming to keep it at around or just above 2%. What if it goes a little bit over 4 or 5% for a year or two? It's not seen as too drastic. But what if it went further? What if it went to 10? What if it went to 20%? What if it went beyond that? Well, suddenly a nation's economy is looking quite fragile. So let's bring it towards France. What's exactly happening for France at this time? Well, the economy actually is facing this kind of crisis. It's actually under King Louis XVI facing bankruptcy by the time it gets to 1787 and into 1789. How did this even happen? Well, France initially was quite a prosperous country in the mid 1700s. It was a large nation. It had many, many miles of agricultural land to grow food, and its population was undergoing something of a boom. Overseas trade was flourishing as France had colonies throughout the world, some even all the way in the Americas, and internal trade was expanding not just in France, but throughout its network in Europe. Industry was also growing as well, on account of making the ships to trade and travel. However, these apparent successes were only concealing the serious problems that were within the Ancien regime's financial system. One way this was revealed was through the wars that France was fighting. It already had some conflicts against Spain and Poland, but it really got bad against after the Austrian War of Succession and the American War of Independence. France already had suffered failures in wars before. For instance, its 7 Years' War against Great Britain had been expensive, and France, for all intents and purposes, had lost that war economically. To try and get some sort of revenge, the nation was convinced to back the American colonists in the War of Independence throughout 1778 83. In this war, the American colonists were fighting against Britain, against their monarchy, and the taxation system it was putting on them as a colony. It's quite ironic of France. France is very much an absolute monarchy, but yet is helping a nation that wants to become a republic to depose and remove the influence of their own monarchy. It's quite interesting. In some ways, you could say it's poetic that this war France supported in some way backfires and has an impact on them in removing their own monarchy in years to come. So the impact of the war is quite simple. They are indeed successful in helping the Americans, but the Americans, rather than repaying France for their efforts, actually don't reward them economically in any way. And so France, despite all of its success, falls into financial crisis. So to pay for the wars, the government has to do one very simple thing, which is borrow lots and lots of money because it's found itself in a deficit. However, every time the king and his advisors took out these loans, the future of mounting debts and repayments grew. A key problem was happening, which was the economy was not able to make money in the long term to pay off these debts. Instead of trying to fix this system, the king and his ministers were instead using taxation to squeeze as much money as possible from France's established systems, even resorting to putting new taxes on the population. One of these was the Vingtième. This is quite literally translated as the tax of the 20th, which puts a tax on all income paid by everyone except the clergy, and therefore the First Estate. It was introduced in 1749 after the first wars, but it was initially meant to be temporary. But somehow we get to the 1780s and it's still being taken, and not just taken, but also increased in the amount it's taking, especially among the Third Estate. Unsurprisingly, these mounting tax demands were resented by many in French society, especially from the noble class, who were not used to having to pay taxes, but now had gone a whole generation and more now in having to pay taxes. While theoretically France was comparatively well off compared to some of its other European neighbours, its resources were locked out by the outdated and inefficient system of this ancien regime. And so we fast forward now to 1788, where 51% of all government expenditure is now paying this interest on the royal debt that is building up. In the levy, the French currency at the time, the income is 503 million. However, what it's spending is 629 million. So we get a massive deficit of 126 million. And because of this, Louis XVI is now finding that France is spending a vast amount of money more than it is bringing in. Before you know it, all it takes is a few more years of this, and France's economy is not only going to run out of savings that's built up over the years, but is, as we said, going to face bankruptcy. So that's our wider problem. All the wars France has got involved in has indeed weakened the economy and is struggling to recover from it despite years of taxation. But maybe this could have been solved if the tax burden problem had been resolved. As we said, members of the clergy and nobility are not having to pay any or if only some tax at all. Traders and merchants, the bourgeois of the Third Estate, are aiming to try and gain enough money to join the ranks of nobility to purchase titles or offices and therefore abandon their trade. This means that although 98% of the population makes up of the Third Estate, the wealthiest within them are not using their money to pay off the debt. They're instead using their money to escape paying debt by becoming nobles instead by buying titles. While indeed this is seen as the way to improve one's social standing in French society in the 1700s, it is also creating a long term economic problem. Because what you're having here is that the poorest people in society are paying the vast amounts of money, but the richest are either getting out of it or barely paying any at all. It also doesn't help that the system is completely inefficient. Land is distributed unevenly, so much that land is only held in small quantities by the peasantry, particularly amongst their small farms. The peasants, because of the situation, all can't even improve their social standing, and they also can't even improve the productivity of their land. Every time they earn money, it is being taken away from them pretty much straight away. And so farming, rather than growing as an industry, is actually remaining inefficient or worse, declining. And so because of that, France is not really undergoing any sort of agricultural improvement the same way Britain is and evolving into what will eventually become an industrial revolution for them. It also means France is now very, very much vulnerable to any sort of famine that occurs. So bad harvests actually get worse in the 1780s, and this compounds the problem that has been growing for some 20, 30 years now. The bad harvest cause inflation and debt to only rise, and in doing so, make it harder for the poor to earn any money. They can't earn money, they therefore struggle to improve their farming industry. Another harvest hits they can't recover from. France in the 1780s is trapped in a negative economic cycle, where the worse the economy gets, the harder it becomes to improve, and because it can't improve, the economy only gets worse. And this continues and continues. So by 1786, before you know it, the economy is in massive crisis. There is a high use of loans with loads of interest on them that they just can't pay back because taxation is just simply inadequate, and the population are resenting the king because he's allowing this problem to continue. And not just continue, but it's getting worse. And this isn't just a rural problem as well, this is expanding to impact urban life as well. The king struggled to pay these financial wars off. The Ancien regime's tax system is far, far too inefficient, and we have ever increasing debt mounting on French society. And this is affecting all of society, as we say. Labourers and feudal peasants, so those who, of course, are renting and working on the land of a local noble lord, are having to live quite literally hand to mouth. Between 1730 and 1770, the amount of food produced was generally increasing, but because these harvests are going so badly, because we're having these famines, life is much different by the 1780s. In fact, there are many famines. There's one in 1778, 79, 81, 82, 85, 86, and 87. Practically a whole decade has been wrought with bad harvests and awful famine. And because of this, we actually have a rise in starvation, an increase in poverty, and worst of all, we have a population that is unable to feed their families at all. And so this manifests as well, not just in the rural life, but in the urban world as well. Production and employment in the textiles industry, for instance, falls by 50% by 1789. Urban workers are now having to spend the vast majority of their money to just afford bread. But because of that, you're creating a supply and demand problem where now the supply of bread is massively collapsing, and therefore its price, because it's in such high demand, people can't make their own bread anymore. It's now vastly rising by 50% by March time. Both the peasants and urban workers are struggling with this. And this, unsurprisingly, creates a time where people see the only solution is to riot. By the spring in 1789, a worker in Paris could be directly spend nearly 90% of his wages on bread alone. And this creates a crisis on the 28th of April when a house and factory of a prosperous wallpaper manufacturer, Revlon, was set on fire, as it was rumored that he was going to reduce the wages of his workers. This riot is very important because it shows that there is a clear protest occurring from the people because of the lack of food and the high price of bread. The riot leads to 50 people dying or being wounded by the French Guard, who the king has to disperse to dispel the rioters. And this, of course, unsurprisingly, links back to Louis. Because he's responding with the military, this means now he's now in the picture again, and he is taking some of the blame, wrongly or rightly, for what is occurring. By the summertime of 1789, the situation in Paris is quite volatile, quite unpredictable. The economic issues have not improved, and the crisis has only worsened. But what it has done is create a popular movement among these discontented workers in the city. These workers will eventually become the sans culottes, who will riot even more so against the king and the ruling bodies in Paris. So let's bring it together. Let's summarize then how exactly these economic problems are indeed causing a revolution. Now, it's very clear that the economy is a vast problem. We said this way back in What Could Cause a Revolution, and we did say it would be a dire and suffering economy, and that is indeed what this is. The tax system has unfairly burned the third estate for generations now. The harvests have only made this problem more pronounced because they've worsened the economy, they've ruined the price and availability of bread, and they've now created a crisis that one can't simply mask over with a fancy speech or a bit of a gift from the clergy or a bit of prayer. This is a very real problem that is affecting French society. And unlike political power, when that gets corrupt, when the economy falls out like this with high inflation and poor labor, the government simply can't control it and they can't do anything about it. But they have to do something. And maybe they have been doing something throughout this time. And that's something that we're going to consider in our following video when we look at the government response throughout these years. We're going to go back a little bit before 1789 and see if the government tried to solve these problems before they became so dire and rioting and revolution in the streets became pretty much a certainty. And that's where we're going to leave the video for now. We'll look at that in the following video, as I say. What do you think so far? Now we know a bit about the economic problems and what was happening there. Do you think this is now more important than society's structure as a whole? Is it more important than Louis? Or in some way, is this all connected? Is the economy just one manifestation of how this broken ancien regime was already fractured from the start with the estates and the monarchy designed the way it was? Also, feel free to check as well in my description box some further reading to understand the economics some more, if you so wish. But I'll see you in the following video and see if Louis was indeed trying to solve this problem before it got to this situation in 1789. So with that said, this has been History with Sire, and thank you for listening.